What's up, everybody? My name is Maddie. I'm here with my friend Tim, and we are pastors here at The Gathering. In worship, we're in a series called Dynamic Duo, where we're talking about the need that we have to be invested in by other people and to invest in the people in our lives. We're highlighting some relationships that we find in Scripture that talk about that, and we're seeing what they can share with us about what it looks like to live in that mutual kind of investment in our relationships. The dynamics that we're exploring are interesting because they hold just like so much depth to them. There's a ton of context and facts and themes that don't make it into the message every week. And so we decided to sit down and take some time to unpack these stories a little further, sharing some of the content that might have landed on the cutting room floor. So, Pastor Tim.
Yo.
How you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me, Maddie. This is a great opportunity. I'm so excited to share a little bit about the story of Nathan and David and how they were their own dynamic duo, if you will.
What an intro. I am so excited to hear more about that. Can you give us just like a crash course summary of their story?
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. So in ancient Israel, there were a couple of different roles that were essential to carrying on the communication between God and God's chosen people. And here we have the ascension, so to speak, of David to the throne. So he is a king of Israel, one of the good kings of Israel. And always they were put on the throne by God, and there was also prophets who would come alongside of them. So there was always this dyad in any healthy sort of monarchy. There was also someone else who really had the ear of God or had the voice of God that would speak directly to the king. So even though we think that the king is the person in charge, Israel was trying to do this thing that I don't know if has ever been attempted to do again, where actually God is the one in charge. And so the God speaking through the prophet to the king is maybe even more important than the king because it's pointing toward the ultimate authority.
Yeah, that's interesting. So in this story or relationship between Nathan and David and kind of this dynamic of relationship to God, to power, like how those play together, what are some themes or things that you've been kind of kicking around in the process of going through the story again?
Yeah, it's a fascinating story. It sort of begins with Nathan being dropped in, just kind of like airlifted and just like in the story. Bloop, boom. Here's the new prophet who speaks for God. His name's Nathan, and he's going to go and talk to David. And so one of the first encounters that appears in 2 Samuel chapter 7 is David talking to Nathan. And David's like, you know what? I live in this amazing palace, and yet God is out kind of in a tent. I think it's time that we build God a temple. And Nathan's first response is, yeah, you're the king. You know what's up. You know what's good. Let's do that. The story continues with Nathan going home and basically like that night having a dream from God where God tells Nathan, no, that's not it. You need to go back kind of against the promise or whatever you had just shared with King David and share with him a different response, one that he probably isn't going to be happy to receive. But the truth is that God did not want that temple to be built just yet with David on the throne, but rather to hold off on that until one of David's ancestors turns into Solomon, and that kind of jumps ahead a little bit in the story. But also in this wait not yet message from the prophet to the king is some really good news that David holds close to his heart, which was that there would be this dynasty that would be established from him moving forward.
It's interesting in that story. One of the things I was thinking about is this idea on David's end of, well, I'm the king and I live like this. God, according to how we're operating, is above me, and God is in a tent. I must make God's space look like my space, and kind of thinking about like this proximity to power in the relationship of how we view what it means to be held in esteem. And I always think it's interesting that, you know, in my mind, it would make sense as well. Like, I'm living in a palace, God should be in a palace. And yet God's like, no, that's not actually what I want, right. Which then makes you confront kind of all of the notions that you have around what does it mean to represent and reflect authority and power and some of those things spatially.
Yeah. Yeah, it does get into the whole understanding of something that I think was really present early on in like the Hebrew scriptures and in the Exodus narratives of God not really wanting that sign of wealth and earthly power. And the Israelite community understood that in a way like leaving the throne empty, like this is where God is, and God is simultaneously everywhere. Like these huge ideas of monotheism that are just like exploding on the scene that, I mean, how crazy would that be for you to just kind of hear like, oh my goodness, what is this about? Like there's one God? Like that would just be such earth-shattering news. And the way that does play with the earthly notions, our human notions of what we associate with power and wealth and prestige, it really does diverge.
Yeah. I'm also curious you had talked a little bit about this relationship between Nathan and David, and then Nathan going and having this revelation from God that God didn't actually want the temple to be built, at least not yet. Can you talk about like that dynamic, or even this idea of like Nathan changing his mind and how that impacts their relationship?
Yeah, it is something that it's pretty marvelous in and of itself. Like there is room in this relationship for reconsideration. There's room for a second chance, a time to kind of start again, a time to say, hey, I wasn't exactly right. Like I thought I had every intention of saying what I actually said. Like I believed that to be true. And then I got new information. And so let me kind of clarify that and actually let us do a 180. And so for that to be received just demonstrates for us that there is that opportunity in our relationships as well to start again, to clarify something. Like what we say in the moment doesn't necessarily always have to be the be-all, end-all. Like we can reconsider, you know?
Yeah, I love that. I have thought about that a lot lately, too, in the context of the ongoing conversation around faith deconstruction and reconstruction. And I had a conversation with a friend of mine who was kind of processing through some things that they had said earlier on in their faith journey that now looking back, they're like, ugh, yikes. Like that was probably not the best way to handle that situation. And just having this conversation of kind of like what you talked about, the space that exists for us to be making the most of the scenarios that we're in with the information that we have at the time, while still being open-handed enough to recognize that information could change. Yeah. And that doesn't necessarily have to negate that we believed it to be true at one point. And like having those relationships where we can be honest about believing one thing or saying one thing or getting behind one thing and then changing our mind, like how valuable that is in our own development as people.
Yeah. On the negative side, there is also room for hypocrisy. I mean, talk about something that goes right to deconstructing faith, right? Whenever we see hypocrisy played out in the public sphere, it leads so many folks to question everything. And here, the second part of the Nathan and David story is very much about what happens when someone is not who they purport to be or acting in a way that they said they would. So there's this invasion going on. There's this military conflict that the Israelites are engaged in, and King David says that no male should be interacting with women in a sexual way during this time of war, basically. And then he sees this beautiful woman who's bathing. Her name is Bathsheba. The text says that it's Uriah the Hittite's wife. So both of them can be used as her name should be used, but then also the text more often refers to her as Uriah's wife, like just reminding us of just the fact that women were seen as secondary to the man, and so defining her kind of in relationship to the man. So David does not listen to his own tasks, set before the military, the men, and acts on this lustful inclination in his heart. I mean, just talk about the ways in which he's so hypocritical. He was the one who instituted that rule. And then there's also other pre-existing rules that talk about like the sanctity of husband and wife, kind of the marital relationship. And then not only does he go forward with having a sexual relationship with Bathsheba, he fathers a child with her, and then in order to try to cover it up, he calls back Uriah the Hittite from this military battle and tries to get him drunk in order to sleep with his wife, to disobey the rule that he put in place. Like, it just gets, it's so Game of Thronesy. It's just right there.
It is. Yes. Game of Thrones is like the best example. You're like, what are you even doing? And that's part of him and Nathan's conversation, isn't it?
Yeah.
Of Nathan coming back and being like, Bestie, you need to take care of this.
Yeah. So 2 Samuel 12, there's this big conversation where David eventually has Uriah the Hittite killed by putting him at the forefront of the battle. Once Uriah wanted to pay attention to King David's rules and not sleep with his wife, because David thought, oh, there could be a cover-up here, and Uriah could, the fatherhood of this child could be Uriah, even though it wasn't. So the cover-up is often where we get in a world of trouble. So not only is there issues and laws that have been broken by the king in relationship with the wife of Uriah, but now by basically having him killed, by putting him at the front of the battle, I mean, it's just murder then on top of that. Like,
right.
the cover-up can be as bad or worse than the crime, or, I mean, it's just one bad thing. It's like a dark comedy, where like one bad decision leads to other terrible decisions, and it just gets worse and worse and worse. And so finally, Nathan has this dream in which God speaks to him and causes him to confront David by sharing this parable about how there was a poor man who only had one little lamb, and the rich person, the rich ruler, like, has that lamb killed. And King David hears this parable right from Nathan and was like, oh my gosh, this is such injustice. That person was acting demonically, like the text says. Something must be done to bring this person to justice. And Nathan says, that man is you.
Woof.
Whoa.
Yikes.
Whoa. Bringing it, like, that man is you. And immediately, and this is what's remarkable too, all that awful stuff that David did, he repents right in the moment. Now, we can go into a longer conversation about what repentance looks like and what justice looks like, and was that just, or can the fact that he's the king, can he just kind of get away with it in the moment here by turning his life around? There is a beautiful psalm that he does end up writing, Psalm 51, where create in me a clean heart, O God, and so Nathan assures him that his words are true and adequate to kind of get him out of the situation, and that this dynasty that was earlier promised will, in fact, continue. But David's also in for a world of hurt with what he had just done and now has admitted to.
Yeah. What a story. It is. I think Game of Thrones is really accurate.
Yeah. And so then, like, the child is eventually born, the child that David had with Bathsheba out of wedlock. Eventually, Bathsheba comes into his harem before this part of the story, and is a part of, basically, he's in relationship with her. But the child is born and then dies. And, like, for that time, though, before the child dies, David's just, like, making himself prone before God and, like, starving himself, basically, as this goes on and on and on, and just showing how sorry he is, showing how recalcitrant he is for the actions that he had committed, in the hopes that God could change God's mind and maybe spare this child, just kind of feeling like this child is sort of doomed.
Yeah.
Well, eventually he eats food and, like, puts on clothes and, like, goes back to being the king that he was before and trying to move in really positive directions, and ends up comforting Bathsheba and fathering another child with her. And this is where, like, we see Nathan again as kind of the sparrow or whomever, just kind of like whispering into words of, because there was a struggle. There were other children that David had that had a claim to the throne. And so how would this child have a claim to the throne? This is interesting too. David wanted to name him Jedediah. And then Nathan's like, no, his name should be Solomon. And so that's what happened. His name was Solomon because that's what Nathan said it should be. So
interesting.
Yeah.
Can you imagine if you just, like, always named your children based off of that, like, one friend who was like, actually, I hate that name, scrap it. What's next?
No one does that. No one can do that. That's why you either don't tell people or, keep it a secret until the last minute.
It is interesting. Just like the relationship dynamic of Nathan and David, and like having this advisor that kind of speaks into your life and calls you out on your stuff.
Yeah.
And holds you accountable, and like kind of, you know, names things as they're seeing them in real time. And being able to do that and then still be in someone's life after the fact long enough to essentially name their child for them because you don't like the name that they picked. But like to have that kind of a dynamic of a lasting relationship and being able to truly and honestly speak into someone's life, I think is special and requires a ton of trust. You know?
It's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful thing to have that kind of relationship with persons where they can be fully and completely honest. Like they can be fully and completely themselves and share with you exactly what is on their heart. Hopefully trusting that whatever it is, as good or as bad as it could be, that there's still going to be a relationship after this.
Yeah.
And that is the propelling dynamic of this duo.
Yeah. There's a safety in a type of relationship like that leads to growth because you're not concerned that it's going to be gone. Yeah, which is special. Well, Pastor Tim, thank you for having this conversation.
It's been my pleasure, Maddie.
Yeah, expanding this out a little bit. I'm excited to connect all of these pieces together with the message. Because again, this is one of those conversations that, you know, the story is so layered. There's so many directions you can take it. It's hard to narrow down on just one thing for worship on Sunday. But friends, thank you so much for listening. Be sure to head over to the Gathering app or gatheringnow.org to listen to the sermon that pairs with this episode. And we look forward to seeing you around.